I'd been waiting all week for this little trip. Just me, my backpack, and a patch of forest I'd found online that promised quiet trails and a small, hidden campground by the lake. I wasn't looking for anything adventurous, just a couple nights away from the constant hum of traffic and the glow of my apartment walls. The kind of silence you only get when you're miles from the nearest gas station or street light. The trailhead was almost empty when I pulled in that afternoon. A single other car sat dusty and sunbaked in the lot. I never saw anyone on the way up. The path wound through pines and birches, the air still heavy with the warmth of late summer. Every step crunched on dry needles and leaves. When I reached the side, it wasn't much, just a clearing big enough for 2 tents, ringed by trees so dense they felt like walls. But it suited me fine. I set down my pack, unrolled the tent, and staked it into the earth with that small sense of satisfaction only campers understand. A little nylon bubble of shelter, waiting to be filled with my sleeping bag and the smell of damp canvas. I boiled some noodles on my camp stove, the simple kind you can buy in bulk for a couple of bucks, and ate them straight from the pot with a plastic fork. Nothing fancy, nothing worth remembering, and yet at that moment I felt oddly content. The lake wasn't far, just beyond the tree line, and I sat on a log with my boots off, letting the evening cool seep into the ground beneath me. A loon called from somewhere across the water. The sound echoed, low and haunting, but in a way that was natural, even comforting. As dusk deepened, I zipped myself into the tent, pulled a book from my bag, and listened to the first distant grumble of thunder roll over the horizon. Just weather, I thought, just a summer storm. By the time I set my book down, the storm had moved closer. The rain started softly, tapping the tent in irregular rhythms. It was almost pleasant at first, like a soundtrack for sleep. I stretched out in my sleeping bag, closed my eyes, and tried to let the sound carry me off. But then I heard it, something sharper than the rain, a distinct snap of a branch, somewhere just beyond the tent. I froze, listening. For a long moment, there was only the storm, the occasional rumble of thunder, and the rush wind through leaves. I told myself it was nothing. Deer, maybe, or a raccoon nosing around for scraps. Still, I found myself reaching for the flashlight beside me. I clicked it on and aimed the narrow beam at the nylon wall. Nothing, just pale light spilling across fabric, shadows shifting with the trees outside. I waited until my heartbeat slowed again, then clicked it off and rolled onto my side. A few minutes later, I caught it again. Not just a snap this time, something closer. A shuffle, deliberate, slow, like footsteps dragging through wet leaves. My mouth went dry. I unzipped the tent a few inches and poked the flashlight beam out into the storm. Raindrops glittered as they cut across the light. The clearing was empty. My campsite looked just as I left it, pack leaning against the log, stove cooling on the ground. Beyond the circle of light, the forest pressed in, black and impenetrable. I kept the light steady for as long as I could, scanning back and forth, half expecting to catch a glint of eyes or the pale flicker of a face. But there was nothing, just the endless curtain of rain and the low groan of thunder rolling over the hills. Finally, I zipped the tent closed again and lay back down, telling myself what I needed to believe. It was just the storm playing tricks, just branches moving, just the forest settling. Still, it took a long time before I could convince myself to close my eyes again. Sleep wouldn't come easy. Every time I drifted close, another sound pulled me back, something foreign that didn't belong to the storm. Rain drummed against the nylon, thunder cracked above, but neath it all there were other rhythms, softer, closer. At first it was like the faint drag of something brushing against the tent wall, a light scrape, then gone. I sat up, pulse racing, straining to listen. Nothing, only the steady hiss of rainfall. I laid back down again, but my body stayed tense, ears tuned for the slightest break in pattern.
It didn't take long. A new sound rose above the storm. Crunch, pause, crunch. Footsteps. At least that's what they sounded like to me. Measured, deliberate. Not the erratic scurry of an animal, but weight pressing down on wet leaves. I held my breath. The steps seemed to circle the clearing, staying just beyond where I imagined my fire pit would be. Slow, patient, unhurried. I wanted to call out, say something like, "Hello? Who's there?" But the words jammed in my throat. If it was another camper, what would they be doing, wandering in the rain at this hour? And if it wasn't a camper, the flashlight was back in my hand before I realized it. I flicked it on, the beam cutting across the tent's thin walls. Shadows warped and jumped with every gust of wind, but nothing solid appeared. My breath fogged the inside of the nylon, and I wiped it away with my sleeve, trying to keep the light steady. The footsteps stopped. That was somehow worse than hearing them. I leaned closer to the wall, every nerve screaming at me not to, but I couldn't help it. My ear pressed against damp fabric, and for a second I swore I heard breathing. Shallow, ragged, not mine.
Lightning cracked, flooding the clearing with white light for the briefest instant. Through the fabric, I thought I saw a shadow move. Something tall, upright, gone before my eyes could focus. I yanked the zipper down an inch and shot the flashlight out, sleep in the clearing. Nothing. The beam caught only rain and trees, my gear untouched where I'd left it. The forest beyond seemed to lean in closer, waiting. I zipped the tent shut again, hands trembling, and sat in silence, heart hammering so loud I was sure whatever was out there could hear it too. The storm pressed harder against the tent, rain petting in heavy sheets, thunder rolling so close it rattled through my chest. I told myself that whatever I thought I'd seen or heard was gone, driven off by the weather, by the light, by my imagination. I repeated it over and over, trying to will it into truth. And then the tent wall bowed inward. Just a few inches at first, like the breeze had pushed against it. But then it held there, stretched tight, the distinct shape of a hand pressing into the nylon. 5 splayed fingers, firm and deliberate. My stomach dropped.
I scrambled backward, nearly tangling in my sleeping bag. "Hey!" My voice cracked sharp, swallowed by the storm. "Get out of here!" The pressure lingered for one awful second, then slipped away. The wall popped back into place, trembling with the rain. I waited, flashlight clutched in both hands, aiming its useless beam at the spot, as if the light could somehow hold back the dark. The zipper rattled.
just a slight tug, the faintest scrape of metal teeth shifting. Someone or something was testing it. I slapped my hand over the pull tab from the inside, clutching it so hard my knuckles ached. "Leave me alone!" I shouted, but the storm devoured my voice. The tugging stopped. I sat frozen, every muscle tight, listening for the next sound. Seconds crawled by, each one stretching unbearably long. Rain hammered, wind howled, nothing moved. Finally, I worked up the nerve to unzip the flap just enough to shine the flashlight out again. The beam swept the clearing, cutting through the downpour. My pack still leaned against the log. My stove still sat in the dirt. No footprints, no figures, no broken branches, just a wide circle of emptiness that seemed suddenly too quiet. I zipped it shut again, fingers numb, and slumped back against the tent wall. Sleep was impossible now. Every flicker of lightning, every roll of thunder, every rustle of leaves outside sent my heart lurching. I stayed awake, eyes open, waiting for the next press against the fabric. But nothing came. At some point, exhaustion must have dragged me under, because the next thing I knew, pale light was filtering through the nylon. The storm had passed, leaving the forest washed clean and dripping. For a moment, waking felt like relief. Just a bad night. Just nerves. I crawled out of the tent, stretching stiff legs. The clearing looked ordinary again. Almost too ordinary. My pack was still where I'd left it, stove, damp with rain. Birds called from the trees as if nothing had happened at all. And then I saw it. Just beyond the circle of my campsite, in the mud softened by the storm, was a single footprint. Not mine. Too large. Too deep. The edges blurred but unmistakable. It led nowhere, just pressed once into the earth, then gone. I packed past, shoving gear into my bag, refusing to look back. Whatever had been out there, I wasn't staying to find out.
I always liked the sound of rain in the woods, but I never planned on camping through a full storm. When my buddy Ryan suggested we head out for the weekend, the forecast only mentioned scattered showers, nothing serious. So we packed light, just tents, a couple freeze-dried meals, and enough beer to last the night. The trail was slick from the past week's rain, mud clinging to our boots as we hiked in. The air smelled sharp and clean, pine needles mixing with damp earth. We joked about who would wipe out first on the incline, and I snapped a picture of Ryan when he nearly lost his balance on a moss-covered rock. It was easygoing, normal, the kind of trip I'd done a dozen times before. We reached a clearing just as the sun was dropping behind the ridge. Perfect timing. The spot was tucked against a wall of spruce, with a little rise that kept the ground from pooling with water. We pitched our tents side by side, sparks flying from Ryan's lighter as he coaxed the camp stove to life. Dinner was nothing fancy. Instant noodles, jerky, beer cracked open in celebration. But it tasted better than anything we could have ordered in town. By the time we settled in, the woods were already dimming. A loon called from somewhere off in the distance, and Ryan raised his can and a mock toast to the great outdoors. I laughed, clinked our can against his, and for a little while, everything felt exactly how it should. Calm, simple, ordinary. The weather radio we brought buzzed faintly with static and then issued a storm advisory for later that night. Ryan shrugged it off, grinning. Just a little rain. Makes it cozier.
The first drops fell not long after we zipped ourselves into the tents. A lazy patter at first, like someone drumming fingers on the nylon. Then heavier, steadier, until the whole forest seemed to be hissing with rain. Thunder rumbled over the ridge deep enough that I felt it in my chest. I lay back in my sleeping bag, listening. Ryan was in the tent beside mine, close enough that I could hear him shifting around, muttering to himself as he tried to get comfortable. The storm didn't bother me much. Storms never had. They were just part of being out here. But then, between the rolls of thunder, I thought I heard something else. Faint, almost swallowed by the storm. Voices. At first I figured it was Ryan talking, but the more I listened, the less sense it made. The cadence was wrong. Too low, too many syllables, like several people speaking at once. The words themselves were lost in the rain, but the shape of them felt deliberate. I unzipped my tent halfway and peered out, rain soaking my face instantly. My flashlight beam cut a shaky path across the clearing. Nothing. Just Ryan's tent sagging under the downpour, the stove and packs glistening with water, the trees swaying hard in the wind. "Ryan?" I called, raising my voice over the storm. His tent rustled, then his muffled voice came back. "What? Did you hear that?" I paused, then shouted back, "Hear what?" I hesitated, suddenly unsure of myself. Maybe it was the storm playing tricks. Maybe I was just tired. "Nothing," I muttered, zipping the flap shut again. I lay awake, listening, certain I'd catch it again. And I did. A few minutes later, the voices rose once more. Closer now, threading through the rain like they were circling the campsite. The more I tried to ignore it, the harder it became. The voices wove themselves between the rain and thunder, rising and falling as if they were just outside the clearing. Sometimes it sounded like laughter, short, clipped bursts that didn't belong to anyone I knew. Other times it was whispered, hushed, frantic, as though whoever spoke didn't want me to hear, yet somehow wanted me to listen. I pressed my ear against the damp nylon. That's when I caught it. My name, clear as day, carried on the wind. Daniel. My stomach dropped. I sat up fast, unzipping the tent again. The flashlight beam swung across the trees. Shadows jumped with every flicker of lightning. "Ryan!" I shouted, my voice raw. "Did you hear that?" His tent rustled. A long pause. Then, softer than before, "I don't hear anything." But something about the hesitation in his voice made me doubt him. Another flash of lightning split the sky, and for the briefest instant I thought I saw something moved at the tree line. A cluster of figures, tall and still. When the thunder crashed and the light vanished, there was nothing but the forest, black, gripping. I pulled the flap shut, breathing hard. Minutes passed. Then Ryan's voice came again, low, almost reluctant. "Okay, I think I hear it now." The rain pounded harder, and the voices rose to meet it. Not words this time, just sounds, overlapping and distorted. as if a dozen conversations bled together into one. They circled us, never breaking the line of trees, never stepping into the clearing. Other campers, Ryan whispered through the fabric, though neither of us believed it. Nobody would be out here in this storm walking around at midnight. I clutched my flashlight like a weapon and stayed perfectly still, my eyes locked on the trembling walls of the tent. Every time the whispers surged, I swore I felt the ground beneath me vibrate with their presence. By then, sleep was impossible. We lay in silence, waiting, each of us pretending we weren't terrified of what might happen if the voices decided to come closer. At some point, the voices faded. Whether they drifted off with the storm or simply stopped, I don't know. I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes again, sunlight was leaking through the tent. For a moment, I almost convinced myself it had been a dream. The rain was gone, the forest alive again with bird song. Ryan unzipped his tent, looking like he hadn't slept a minute. Neither of us said much while we packed. We didn't need to. It wasn't until we were ready to hit the trail that I noticed the ground. Just beyond the clearing, the mud was disturbed, trampled flat like a dozen people had stood there all night, pacing back and forth. Dozens of footprints, overlapping, pressed deep into the soil. They didn't lead anywhere. No trail in, no trail out. Just a wide patch of ground beaten down like a dance floor in the middle of the woods. Ryan met my eyes, pale and tight-lipped. Let's go. We didn't speak again until we reached the car, and we've never gone back.
I wasn't the kind of person who usually camped alone. Most of my trips were with friends. Noisy groups who brought too much beer and not enough food, laughing loud enough to scare off any wildlife within a mile. But work had been grinding me down lately, and the idea of silence, just me, the trees, and a night sky without city lights was too tempting to pass up. The drive out took longer than expected, winding through back roads until the pavement turned to gravel and to dirt. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was already sinking behind a ridge. I hoisted my pack, adjusted the scraps, and set off down the narrow path. The woods smelled of wet leaves and pine sap, thick and earthy. After about an hour, I found a spot that felt right. A small clearing with just enough space for my tent, ringed by tall firs. The ground was soft but dry, padded with years of fallen needles. I dropped my pack, stretched my aching shoulders, and got to work. Tent first. Poles snapping together, stakes driven deep. Then I laid out my sleeping bag, propped my little lantern on a rock, and felt the comfort of order settle in. Dinner was simple, instant rice and a pouch of tuna, eaten cross-legged beside a small fire I coaxed from damp twigs in a stubborn lighter. Not gourmet, but warm. The firelight pushed back the shadows, sparks drifting up into the thickening sky. I pulled out a notebook I sometimes carried on trips, scribbled a few lines about the day, the empty trail, the way the forest seemed untouched. My handwriting wobbled when the first roll of thunder shuddered across the treetops. The fire hissed as a stray drop of rain struck the coals. I leaned back against my pack, watching the tree line sway with the rising wind. Alone, but not lonely. That's how it felt then. The kind of solitude I thought I'd been craving. I didn't know yet how quickly that feeling would change. The storm held off longer than I expected, grumbling in the distance, but never quite breaking. By the time I doused the fire and zipped myself into the tent, the woods had gone strangely still. That's what struck me first, the silence. Forests at night are rarely quiet. There's always something. Crickets, owls, the occasional rustle of a deer pushing through brush. But here, there was nothing. Just the wind slipping in short, nervous gusts through the trees. I told myself it was normal, that maybe the animals had gone quiet ahead of the storm. Still, the unease gnawed at me. When lightning flared, I thought I caught movement at the edge of the clearing. A dark shape, gone the second the light faded. I froze, holding my breath, waiting for it to appear again. Nothing. Only shadows, swaying branches. I flicked my flashlight on and swept it in a wide arc through the mesh window. The clearing looked empty. My gear sat where I'd left it, glistening faintly from the damp air. At the tree line, dozens of eyes reflected back for a split second before vanishing. Maybe deer, I thought, though none of them made any sound. The rain finally began, light at first, a scattered patter against the nylon. I crawled deeper into my sleeping bag, telling myself I was imagining things, that I was just too keyed up, unused to being out here without the comfort of other voices around me. But as the minutes stretched on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every shift of the trees looked like something moving. Every pause in the wind felt like breath held just outside my tent. I forced myself to shut off the flashlight, close my eyes, and wait. The storm was coming, and maybe, I thought, the rain would be loud enough to drown out whatever it was I thought I heard. The storm hit in earnest just after midnight. Rain hammered the nylon overhead, a relentless drumming that made it hard to think. Thunder cracked so close it rattled through the ground, shaking the little stakes that held my tent upright. At first, I welcomed the noise. It gave me something concrete to focus on, the distraction from the crawling unease in my chest. But storms don't mask everything. In fact, sometimes they make the quiet breaks stand out sharper. Between the thunderclaps, I heard it. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Deliberate. I sat upright, every nerve jangling. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might drown the sound. But no, it was there, circling. The steps dragged through wet leaves, circling the clearing like someone pacing just beyond sight. Lightning split the sky, and for an instant, the world outside was lit in harsh white. A shadow passed across my tent wall, upright, human-shaped. I clamped my hand over my mouth to stifle the sound that tried to escape. The silhouette vanished with the darkness. I scrambled for my flashlight and flicked it on, aiming at the nylon. Nothing, just the pale glow of fabric lit from within. Then, something brushed the side of the tent. A slow, deliberate sweep, like a hand dragging across the wall. My throat closed a tight knot of panic choking me. The zipper rattled once, just a tug, enough to jolt me into motion. I lunged forward and grabbed the inside of it, holding it tight, knuckles white. "Get out of here!" I shouted, though my voice cracked thin against the roar of rain. The sound stopped instantly. The clearing went dead silent again, save for the storm. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I sat clutching the zipper, listening, waiting for it to start again. Minutes stretched like hours, and then the silhouette returned. I saw it only when lightning strobed again, a tall figure standing utterly still among the trees, watching. By the time the sky went dark again, it was gone, but I knew it hadn't left. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the zipper, every muscle aching from tension. The storm raged on, the rain so heavy it blurred the world into a constant roar. But underneath it, I swore I heard breathing. Not mine. Something slow, heavy, damped with exertion, just outside the thin sheet of nylon that separated me from the night. My hand fumbled for the hatchet I kept beside my pack. The wooden handle felt slick against my palm, and I gripped it so tight my fingers cramped. I told myself I'd use it if I had to, that I'd swing the second the zipper moved again. Lightning flashed, flooding the tent with white. A shape loomed at the edge of the clearing, motionless. I blinked, and it was gone. Another flash, closer this time. There it was again, nearer now, just at the circle of my gear. I couldn't scream, couldn't move. All I could do was stare at the nylon, waiting for the inevitable sound of the zipper sliding open. But it never came. Instead, the storm grew louder, masking everything until I couldn't tell if the pounding in my ears was thunder or my own pulse. Time stretched into something unrecognizable. My lantern sputtered out, leaving me in total darkness, except for the erratic bursts of lightning. Each flash carved a new, brief snapshot. Shadows shifted, branches swinging, something standing too close. Then the breathing stopped. The silence was worse. I sat rigid, hatchet in hand, every nerve straining for the slightest sound. But there was nothing. Just the storm and the empty black pressing in. I don't remember falling asleep, only that at some point my body gave out. When I opened my eyes, the world was washed in pale gray light. The storm had passed. My tent sagged under the weight of the water, seams dripping steadily under the ground sheet. For a few blissful seconds, waking felt like relief. Then memory returned. I unzipped the flap cautiously, hatchet still in my grip, and stepped out into the clearing. There was cool, clean, carrying that fresh scent of rain-soaked pine. The forest looked ordinary again. Birds calling, branches dripping, sunlight breaking weakly through the clouds. But the ground told a different story. All around my tent, the mud was marked with footprints, large, deep, pressed into the softened earth. They circled again and again, overlapping until the clearing looked like it had been worn into a path. I followed him a few feet out, expecting him to lead back to the trail. They didn't. The track stopped just beyond the trees, as though whatever had been there had simply vanished into the forest. I packed quickly, heart hammering, never looking back. And to this day, I can't shake the feeling that it watched me until dawn.
It had been months since the four of us managed to line up our schedules. Between work, classes, and family stuff, getting a weekend free felt like winning the lottery. So when Ryan suggested a 2-night camping trip out by the river, we all jumped on it. We weren't hardcore hikers, far from it. We had too much gear,
too much food, and none of us knew how to pack light. Our backpacks bulged with things we didn't really need, and by the first mile, we were already joking about who would be the first to throw theirs into the woods. The trail itself was beautiful, though. Dense evergreens broken by slants of sunlight, the smell of pines sharp in the air. We took turns teasing each other, sharing snacks and pointing out every half-interested mushroom or twisted tree root like it was some kind of discovery. It wasn't about the hike, not really. It was about being together, away from deadlines and noise. By the time we reached the ridge line, we could hear the river far below, a steady rush that promised cool water and a place to set up camp. Spirits were high, and the last stretch down toward the valley felt like the easy part. None of us had any reason to think the trip would be anything but normal. We were cutting down toward the river when Jess spotted it first. "Hey, look over there." At first, I thought she meant another group's campsite. A small clearing opened up just off the main trail, and sure enough, there was a tent pitched in the middle. But as we got closer, it was clear something was off. The tent wasn't standing so much as slumped over itself. Poles snapped or missing. A rain fly dangled loose, stained with moss. Around it lay scattered gear, a rusted camp stove, a pair of boots half buried in leaves, a folding chair tipped on its side. It looked like someone had just walked away. "Creepy," Ryan muttered, nudging the chair upright with his foot. The fabric was rotted through, crumbling at the touch. There was food, too. Steel sealed packets of trail mix and powdered soup, faded but intact. A backpack leaned against a tree, its straps frayed but otherwise untouched. Even the water bottles inside had a little slosh left. "It's like they just left everything," Jess said. Her voice was low, like she didn't want to disturb whatever air clung to the place. We stood there for a while, no one sure what to say. Some of us were curious, imagining stories of lost hikers or emergencies. Others just felt the weight of it, like the clearing held on to whatever had happened. Eventually, Ryan shrugged. "Old junk. Let's set up closer to the river. We'll be fine." None of us argued. But as we walked on, I kept glancing back at the collapsed tent, its dark mouth gaping open toward the trees. We set up our tents about 100 yards downstream, close enough to hear the rush of water, but far enough from the ruined site that we wouldn't have to look at it. The river smelled fresh, cool, and the steady current masked most other sounds. For a while, it felt almost normal again. Fire crackling, noodles boiling, jokes bouncing back and forth between us. And once the last of the daylight bled out of the sky, the mood shifted. It started with small things, branches snapping too sharply, like footsteps in the underbrush. Shapes flickering in the firelight just beyond where the glow reached. Every time one of us turned, nothing was there. On the trees, only shadows. I caught myself glancing upstream more than once, in the direction of that abandoned campsite. Even without seeing it, I could picture the collapsed tent and the gear left to rot. I wondered if the original owners had sat here, in this same spot, listening to the woods in the same uneasy silence. But when lightning flashed for the briefest instant,
I thought I saw someone standing beside that ruined tent upstream, tall, still, watching. No one slept much. We argued in whispers about leaving, but the rain started soon after, trapping us in our tents. The storm rattled the trees, drowned everything else out, but the feeling remained that we weren't the only ones out there by the river. The storm eased just before dawn. When I unzipped my tent, the forest was dripping and gray, the river swollen with rain. My friends emerged one by one, all of us looking like we'd been awake all night. Nobody spoke much. We just wanted to pack and head out. Before we left, though, Jess pointed upstream. It's gone. We walked back toward the clearing, half dreading what we'd find. And sure enough, the ruined tent and all that scattered gear had vanished. No stove, no boots, no backpack, not even scraps of fabric or rusted metal. Just damp earth, pine needles, and a patch of ground that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Ryan swore under his breath. I wanted to believe we'd gotten turned around somehow, that we'd stumbled onto the wrong clearing, but I knew the truth. It was the same spot. As we hiked out, the mud told a worse story. Fresh footprints followed the same trail we did, not ours. Bigger, deeper, pressed into the wet soil, and they didn't stop.
I'd camped in those woods a dozen times before, usually with friends, sometimes with my brother. But that weekend, everyone else was busy, and I figured one night alone wouldn't hurt. The spot was only a couple hours from home, quiet, secluded, and close enough to a little stream that I could fall asleep to running water. The day went as smooth as any camping trip could. I set up my tent in a small clearing, cooked a packet of rice and beans on my stove, and sat on a log watching the sun sink behind the trees. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and when the sky faded to a wash of blue and orange, I felt content in a way I hadn't in weeks. By 9, I was zipped inside my tent with my headlamp on, scribbling in my journal and half reading the paperback I'd brought along. The forest was alive with normal night sounds, crickets, the occasional snap of a branch, the distant call of an owl. Ordinary, peaceful. I must have drifted off sometime around midnight. I woke to a sound that didn't belong. Knock. I opened my eyes in the dark, groggy, unsure if I'd dreamed it. Rain tapped lightly against the nylon. Branches creaked overhead, but then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. 3 deliberate taps, inches from my head. I froze. My mind scrambled for explanations. A branch swaying against the tent? Maybe a squirrel or raccoon nosing around. But it was too precise, too slow, too human. Hello? My voice cracked, sounding thin in the darkness. Silence. I held my breath, straining to hear over the patter of rain. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, from the opposite side of the tent, knock, knock. Closer this time, right against the fabric near my shoulder. Every hair on my body stood on end. I reached for the flashlight beside me and flicked it on, the beam cutting harshly through the nylon walls.
My heart hammered as I yanked the zipper down a few inches and swept the light outside. The clearing was empty. Rain sparkled in the beams, dripping from branches, cooling in the dirt. My pack sat where I'd left it. The fire pit was a circle of wet ashes. Nothing stirred. No footprints, no figures, no eyes shining back from the tree line. I forced myself to check the ground near the tent. The mud was undisturbed. Whatever or whoever had knocked, it left no sign. I zipped the flap shut and sat rigid and darkened, flashlight clutched in my hands. I told myself it was just my imagination, and maybe the rain had shifted a branch just right, tapping in rhythm against the nylon. But deep down, I knew better. I didn't sleep again. Every rustle of leaves, every shift of wind set me on edge. I waited for the knocking to return, but it never did. Just silence, steady rhythm of my own pulse pounding in my ears until dawn. When the first gray light bled into the tent, I unzipped it with shaking hands. The forest looked ordinary again, washed clean by the rain. Birds darted between branches. The stream babbled calmly nearby. Normal. Almost reassuring. Almost. Because when I stepped outside and looked down, my stomach dropped. In the mud, beside my tent, just inches from where my head had been, were handprints. Not paw prints, not random splatters. Handprints. Human-sized, pressed deep into the wet earth, the fingers splayed wide. They smeared down the side of the tent as if something had leaned close, listening. My pack was stuffed in seconds, gear crammed in with no order. I didn't bother with breakfast or a second look. By the time the sun broke properly over the ridge, I was halfway back to my car, glancing over my shoulder every step's few. I'd camped plenty of times since then, but never in that forest, and never alone. Because sometimes, in the middle of the night, I still wake up, certain I'll hear it again. 3 slow knocks, inches from my head.